Jake found out that his wife not only cheated with Tim, but also had another man, Mike, someone who resembled him but was more confident and charismatic. Shocked and stunned, he didn't know what to do. But Emma didn't stop. She made her choice and decided to leave him for Mike. Will Jake be able to forgive her after everything that's happened? And how will he react to the unexpected truth? Jake approached the door, his hands tightly holding the keys, unable to decide whether he should go inside now. Anxiety was building inside him because Emma hadn't answered his calls, and her last message made his heart tighten. Slowly, he took off his coat, deciding that a few more minutes by the open door would help him gather his thoughts. But suddenly, he heard her voice from behind the door, nervous, one he had never heard before. "Jake, don't come in right now. I need to talk to you. It's important." And before his eyes, a shadow flashed, reflected in the glass of the door. Who was it? In an instant, Jake realized that this meeting might change his life forever. Jake made up his mind. He inserted the key into the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. Emma was standing in the corridor, her arms crossed over her chest, and her face wore an expression he couldn't recognize. Her eyes were anxious, but she quickly hid it behind a typical smile. He couldn't understand why she was so nervous. What was going on? "What's wrong, Emma?" His voice sounded distant, like someone else's. He tried to stay calm, but his heart felt that something was off. Emma had always been composed, reliable, loyal. Had she changed? Maybe he had just made too much of a small argument, some regular stress? "You're just stressed about work, Jake. Everything will be fine," she said. Her words seemed like an attempt to reassure him, but there was something in her eyes that sparked doubt. She tried to keep him from talking, as if afraid he would uncover a secret. But Jake couldn't let go of his suspicions. He decided not to give her more chances to avoid answering. "Where's your phone?" he snapped, and her face immediately became stone-like. Jake stepped closer to her, getting a few inches away. Her eyes avoided his, and Jake's heart tightened, for he suspected she was hiding something. "Are you spying on me?" Her voice trembled, but she stood tall, even though she couldn't hide the nervous shaking of her hands. She tried to change the subject quickly, but Jake felt that everything wasn't as it had been before. That evening, Jake couldn't find peace. He kept thinking about the strange moment when he heard the suspicious sound. The way Emma's phone seemed to move as if someone had hidden it. Her unnatural behavior and loud excuses bothered him. It felt like she was hiding something important. This wasn't just a coincidence. The next day, as he went to work, he caught himself thinking, what if it's just my imagination? But peace didn't last long. The call came unexpectedly. His friend, Michael, called to ask if everything was okay with his marriage. "Michael, what do you mean?" Jake asked, slightly nervous. But Michael simply said that he had heard from his friends that Emma had been seen with another man several times over the past week. Jake tried to ignore his words, but at that very moment, he realized that he could no longer just turn a blind eye to his suspicions. Jake decided to learn more, hiring a private detective to follow Emma. That evening, after work, when he came home, he met her again. She smiled, but her eyes no longer seemed genuine. Jake felt like it was time to act again. He didn't know what to expect, but ignoring the situation was no longer an option. "How are your workouts?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "I've noticed you've been out a lot lately. Were you somewhere today?" The question he would never have asked in regular life. But now, everything felt different. Emma looked confused, but there was no doubt on her face. She answered briefly, "I was just rushing with other things. I need more time for myself." At that very moment, his phone rang. It was a message from the detective. "Today, Emma met with a man named James. They left the apartment about 2 hours ago." Everything in his reality crumbled in an instant. He looked at Emma, her empty eyes, which seemed as though she had already decided not to reveal the truth to him. Jake felt his heart tighten. He stood in front of Emma, looking into her eyes, trying to understand why she looked the way she did. Like she didn't care about anything that was happening. Her face showed no emotion, and that troubled him even more. Deep down, he already knew the answer. All these little hints, her behavior, recent changes, all pointed to one thing: betrayal. And it was the most painful thing he had ever felt. You can't be serious, Emma? His voice sounded firm, but there was an invisible anxiety in his eyes. What does all of this mean? How can you treat me like this after everything? Emma didn't answer immediately. It seemed like she was trying to find the right words to justify herself. Then she simply said, Jake, I can't hide this anymore. I'm seeing James. It's not just. Listen, it was my decision. I can't live like this anymore. These words sounded like a verdict. Jake stood silently, not believing his ears. He felt the internal pain tighten his heart. She had betrayed him. And this wasn't some accidental mistake. It was something much more serious. Something that had taken her out of his world. Jake didn't know what to do. It felt like everything he had built with Emma was an illusion. You're leaving me? These were his only words. He couldn't say more because inside, everything had stopped. I don't want to hurt you, Jake, but I haven't felt the same for a long time. Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that ripped his heart apart even more. We're not where we were when we first met. Jake tried to hide his tears, but it was in vain. It hurt to see everything he had tried so hard to preserve falling apart. He and Emma had been together for 10 years, but was that enough for her to betray him? Or was it just a stop in their lives that led to this catastrophe? Jake didn't know how to react. He felt immense disappointment, but at the same time something else, pain and fear. Fear that this situation could destroy him forever. Maybe this isn't the end, she said, but her words brought no comfort. I don't know how it happened. Everything changed so fast, but I can't go back. Jake didn't respond. He found it hard to find the right words. He thought about all the moments when they were happy, when nothing could destroy their world. But now, it all seemed so distant and unattainable. He went to the bedroom, feeling how her words burned his soul. An open wound. All he could do was sit in the dark and think about what to do next. He didn't want to believe it was true, but something inside told him he could no longer live in this deception. Meanwhile, his phone started ringing, and it was from Michael. Jake answered, though he didn't know what to say. Jake, are you there? Came his friend's voice. I know you're going through a tough time right now. You should talk to me, okay? Jake tried to calm himself, but the pain from the betrayal still wouldn't let go. He decided to say it all. Michael, it happened. She cheated on me. I just don't understand why it happened. How did we end up here? Michael was silent for a few seconds before answering. Jake, I know you're feeling really lost right now, but you're not alone. I'm here to help. Let's talk about this. Maybe we can change something. But Jake didn't feel like anything could change. He didn't know what to do next. He just wanted to escape this nightmare and leave it all behind. But his soul wouldn't let him forget what had happened. He would have to go through a lot of pain before deciding whether he could continue with Emma or leave her forever. The night passed slowly, and every moment felt heavy. But despite all these feelings, Jake couldn't allow himself to give up. He knew he had to move forward, even if he didn't know how to do it. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones you have to make when your soul just wants to stop. Jake closed his eyes and quietly said, I will find my way, even if it's painful. The next morning, Jake woke up in the same silence that filled his heart after Emma confessed to the betrayal. His gaze was empty, and his thoughts were confused. He didn't know what to do next. He kept replaying her words in his head, trying to find some logic in what had happened. But it was all meaningless. His life, which had seemed stable just yesterday, was now falling apart like fragments of a windy glass vase. He got out of bed and walked to the window. The fresh air outside felt so foreign, just like his world now. All these years, he and Emma had tried to build something big and important, and now it was hanging by a thread. Jake decided to take a walk, even though he knew it wouldn't change anything. He just wanted to give himself time. As he stepped outside, he looked at his phone. No, there were no new messages from Emma. That hurt too, because she had never ignored him before, even when they had serious disagreements. Suddenly, he received a message from Michael. Jake, are you okay? I think you should talk to me. This is important. Jake looked at his phone again, feeling the pain stretch inside him. He decided to reply. I don't know, Michael. She cheated on me. I don't know what to do. All these years, it all just popped like a bubble. Michael replied immediately. You're not alone. I'll be there in an hour. You can count on me. Jake sighed and continued his walk, but now with the feeling that it was time to make a decision. He knew he couldn't drag this on forever, but he was scared. He didn't know what awaited him. How could he trust again? And most importantly, was it worth keeping it all? An hour later, Michael arrived, and they sat together in a cafe. Jake told him everything, how it was, about their relationship, how Emma had changed, about her strange behaviors, about how he felt without her. Michael listened attentively, not interrupting, but there was understanding in his eyes. I know you're going through a lot right now, and it hurts a lot, but you need to understand that betrayal isn't just a physical act, it's deeper. It's a lack of respect, and you have to understand why it happened before you make any decisions, Michael said. I don't know if I can forgive this, Jake replied, and his voice carried something that made it clear how torn he was. We had it all. I thought our relationship was worth saving. Michael thought for a moment, then said, but, Jake, you can't live in the past. Sometimes we can't change what happened. The only way is to decide whether you want to keep fighting, or maybe it's time to move on. Jake looked into his eyes. It was hard for him to say, but he understood that this was the only way to get through the pain. Maybe I'm not ready to let her go, but I don't know how to continue this anymore. I think deep down, I've already found my answer. You have to choose what really matters to you. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. But know that even in this tough moment, you're not alone. Evening came quickly, and Jake returned home. He stood before the door, hesitating. But he knew this couldn't go on for long. His heart was beating fast, but he'd already made up his mind. When he entered, Emma was home. She hadn't changed. She didn't even look at him when he walked in. It hurt even more. We need to talk, he said. Emma looked up. I know what you're about to say, but I've already made my decision. You've made a decision? You've decided to betray me? The anger in his voice was undeniable, but he couldn't hide the pain. What do you need? What do you want from me? She stood silently, seeming unable to find an answer. The silence grew even heavier. I can't forgive this, Emma, and I can't live with you after this, Jake said, full of resolve. She looked as if she was expecting this, but her gaze was empty. They stared at each other in silence, and Jake realized that they couldn't be together anymore. I'm leaving, he said, gathering his things. Emma didn't stop him. Her gaze was vacant and emotionless. Jake left, leaving behind everything that once mattered to him. But there was a lightness in his heart, though it was bitter. He knew this was the right thing to do. When Jake left the house, he didn't feel relief. Every step he took felt heavy, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He didn't know where he was going, but one thing was clear. He needed to leave everything behind to start over. His soul was torn, but the further he got from the house, the stronger the emptiness inside him grew. Was he ready for this? As he walked down the street, his gaze stopped on his phone, and he noticed a new message from Michael. Are you sure you're okay? Maybe we should meet? You're not answering. Jake sighed and replied, Michael, I don't know what to do. I just left her. All this time, I thought everything would be fine, but now. Before he could finish, another message came through. Wait, I know you're going through a lot, but there's something you need to know about Emma. These words shattered the silence that had settled in his heart. Something was wrong. Michael never used such phrases. Jake couldn't help but ask, what do you mean? A few minutes later, Michael sent another message. You need to come. I know you won't want to believe it, but you have to see this. Jake's heart started beating faster. He didn't want to face this world again, where everything was so tangled and painful. But he understood that if Michael said he needed to see it, he couldn't just ignore his words. Jake decided to go to him. A few minutes later, he stopped in front of the old bar where Michael often met with friends. Jake felt a chill in his heart as he walked inside, and was even more surprised to see Michael waiting at a table with an unfamiliar woman. What does this mean? Jake asked as he approached the table. Michael looked at him, his eyes showing no satisfaction, only seriousness. Jake, I don't know how to explain this to you, but you need to see this. The woman sitting across from him smiled faintly, her gaze calm yet attentive. I understand that it's hard for you, but know that I don't want to do this with your feelings. This is more than just a story of betrayal, she said softly. Jake stared at them, his heart racing. What are you hiding from me? Michael took his phone and showed Jake a video. On the screen, there was Emma laughing and hugging another man. It was like a blow to the heart. This didn't happen just once, the unfamiliar woman said. I know she was cheating on you with another man, and that man is my brother. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't understand what was happening, but the video on the screen left him no choice. Everything shattered. All those years, all those moments seemed to have been on the brink of something big, and now, all his beliefs about their marriage crumbled. I can't believe this, he said, looking away from the screen. The woman sighed. I know it's hard, but my brother was with her even when you two were together. And this didn't happen just once. Jake sat in silence, unable to say anything. His world had been shattered. The moments of happiness they had shared together now felt fake. And now, he had no choice but to figure out everything that had happened. You need to understand that your wife didn't just cheat on you physically, she lied and manipulated you when it was necessary. And what you've learned now is just the beginning. Jake couldn't believe his ears. His inner world was broken, and he didn't know what to do next. But why are you telling me this? Jake asked, looking at Michael. Michael answered calmly, I know it's wrong, but you need to understand that this isn't just your problem. I didn't betray you, Jake. I was your friend, and I couldn't let you stay in this dark circle. These were the words that changed everything. Jake realized that Michael knew more than he could have imagined. He couldn't hide the truth from himself any longer. He had to make a decision. Now you know what happened, and you have to decide what to do next, Michael said, his final words. Jake stood there, his thoughts in turmoil. He didn't know if he could survive more betrayal. But maybe this was a chance for a new life, where he could start over. Jake stood in front of his car, clutching the phone in his hands. His brain refused to accept what he had just seen. He couldn't comprehend that Emma, his wife, the woman he loved, was capable of such a thing. All their years together, all those moments of happiness, love, promises, now seemed ridiculous. His heart was overwhelmed with betrayal, pain, and despair. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain. Something had to change. I can't leave this unanswered, he whispered to himself. But inside, chaos reigned. How could he process all of this? What should he do with this information? Should he try to talk to Emma again? Or was this chapter in their life already over? He turned back to Michael, who remained calm, although there was something sad in his gaze. He couldn't understand why Michael had accepted this turn of events so calmly. Why didn't he feel the same pain as Jake? Why could he speak about it as though nothing extraordinary had happened? I can't be her friend anymore, Michael replied when Jake asked him once more why all this had happened. But I've always been honest with you, even when it was hard. Jake felt as though the last bit of hope was being taken from him. He decided to go home. He needed to see her, to talk to her, to understand why this had happened. He had to know the truth. When Jake entered their home, the silence was so oppressive it felt like the entire atmosphere was stretched to its breaking point. Emma was sitting on the couch, her gaze distant, but she looked calm as if nothing had happened. I know everything, Jake said, standing in the doorway. His voice was cold and sharp. I was shown a video. You cheated on me. Emma lifted her head, her eyes widening in shock. She was silent for a few seconds, trying to find words. Jake, please, I'll explain, she said, standing up from the couch, but her gaze was no longer as confident as it had been before. No, I already know, Emma. You cheated on me with another man. And this isn't the first time. His voice trembled with anger. Emma nervously looked at him. I didn't want this to happen. Everything is so complicated. You don't understand. I don't understand? I don't understand how you could do this to me, to us, he shouted, stepping closer to her. Why? Why did you do this? Emma lowered her head, and a tear appeared on her cheek. I don't know. I thought everything would be fine, but it didn't turn out the way I imagined. Didn't turn out the way you imagined? You don't even realize what you've done. His voice was low, full of despair. He took a step back, trying to understand her. How could he have been so blind for so long? How could all this be hidden? How could there have been such a lie, such a big one? I love you, Jake, but I got lost. And this other man, He was just the one who helped me find myself again, she said, her voice barely audible. You love me? You're telling me that after you cheated on me? He shouted, trying to keep himself together. Jake turned toward the door and took a few steps toward the exit. He couldn't listen to this anymore. It made no sense. He couldn't stay in the same place with this woman. All those years were just lies. Jake, wait. We can fix everything, she shouted, but he didn't turn around. He just left. But as he was leaving the house, it became clear to him. He couldn't just leave and forget everything. Was he really ready to forget all they had? Could he find the strength to start over? And then he remembered. Michael. Everything Michael had said to him at the beginning of this story. Maybe his friend knew more. Maybe all of this was just part of a bigger game, one that Jake had unwittingly become part of. Michael wasn't just a friend. There was something more behind his words. All these questions and doubts attacked his mind as he got into the car. Was this the end of his story with Emma? Or maybe it was just a new beginning? And why hadn't Michael told him the whole truth earlier? These questions remained unanswered as Jake drove into the night. He stopped the car in front of a familiar house. It was the same house where he and Emma had started their life together. Now, the house seemed foreign, cold. Jake asked himself why he couldn't shake off the moments when everything had been perfect. What had happened? What had changed their life so much that now he didn't recognize his wife? What had he missed, and why hadn't Michael been honest with him? Jake pulled out his phone and looked at the video again. His heart clenched as he saw Emma hugging another man. And he hadn't even suspected it. All he had known was that they were happy. How could she betray him like this? What had he missed? His thoughts were racing, and he couldn't stop them. What should he do next? He wasn't ready to let it all go so easily, not ready to be just another victim of betrayal, even if it was painful. He had to find answers. Jake got out of the car, his steps heavy. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, but it wasn't just a question. This was his reality, and he couldn't live in a lie anymore. As he approached the door, his hand fumbled in his pocket. He pulled out the keys and locked the door behind him. He didn't have a plan, but all he needed was to feel that this was his decision, his action. He walked inside. Emma was sitting on the couch, watching him closely. Her face showed no emotion, but Jake could feel the tension and anxiety in the air. She must have heard his footsteps, but she sat motionless, as if waiting for something. Do you want to talk? Her voice was calm, almost too calm. I don't know if there's any point in talking, Emma, Jake replied, standing with his hands in his pockets, trying not to show his emotional confusion. I know you saw the video. I understand your feelings, she said, standing up from the couch and walking towards him. You understand? Jake asked bitterly. You betrayed me, and I found out not from you, but through a video. How could you? Emma was silent for a few seconds, then took another step towards him, as if trying to find the right words. I made a mistake, she said softly, but I didn't want to lose you. You betrayed me. How can you even say you didn't want to lose me? Jake heard his voice becoming sharper. You lied to me, and now you want to talk? This isn't just going to be an apology. Emma took a deep breath, her eyes filled with remorse. I want to explain what happened, but I know you don't want to hear it. I'm losing you, and it hurts. She stood in front of him, her face showing despair and disappointment. Jake looked at her, and in his heart, emotions of love and betrayal, anger and pity, were clashing. He couldn't believe she was capable of this, but on the other hand, she was his wife. They had been together for so many years. He couldn't forget all those happy moments. But suddenly, another question popped into his mind. He looked at Emma, and his voice became cold and angry. Why were you with him? He asked, staring directly into her eyes. Emma flinched. You don't understand, Jake. I didn't mean anything bad. I wanted to feel alive. To feel like I'm more than just a wife. And he was the one who helped you feel alive? This question came out harsh, even more than he had intended. Emma lowered her gaze. It's not that simple. It wasn't just sex or betrayal. It was a moment of weakness. I was missing something in our relationship. Jake took a step back, clenching his fists. He felt his emotions flare up again. Are you trying to say that you don't love me anymore? Emma remained silent, not knowing how to respond. Do you love him? He continued, This time his voice was even softer. Again, silence. There was no answer. But something in Emma's gaze hinted that the situation was more complicated than it seemed. Jake suddenly realized this wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just one moment. This was a whole story that he didn't understand. I get it, he said after a few minutes of silence. But there's something else, isn't there? Emma closed her eyes, and his heart stopped in his chest. You know? What else? Jake stood before her, his heart racing as he heard her words. She cautiously approached him again, but this time her gaze was different, heavy, filled with secrets and uncertainty. He could feel that something was being hidden from him, something more than just infidelity, something he couldn't yet understand. You know? What else? He repeated his question, not taking his eyes off her face. Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling. She looked as if she was struggling to find the right words. Her eyes wandered around the room, not resting on him, and Jake could feel his suspicions growing stronger with every passing second. Something was wrong. Jake, she said, her voice shaking, and her face clouded with doubt. I should have told you this, but I was afraid I'd lose you forever. She paused, taking a breath, then finally said, I'm with someone else. More than just with Michael. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. His legs felt weak, and his thoughts tangled in chaos. What did you say? His voice was muffled, as if he was starting to lose himself in a fog. He couldn't accept it. Two? How is that possible? His heart stopped cold. I cheated on you again, she said, lowering her gaze. It wasn't just Michael. There was someone else. Jake stood there, silently staring at her. All of his emotions nearly exploded inside. He didn't know what to do, how to react, how to process her words. I know this is terrible, Emma continued, her voice now sounding tearful and exhausted. But it's the truth. You were busy with your work, and I started looking for attention elsewhere. And that was my mistake. But all I want now is to fix things. You want to fix this? Jake asked, his voice filled with despair. How can you fix this? You didn't just cheat on me, you cheated on us. How can I ever forgive you? Emma looked up, regret visible on her face, but also fear that Jake wouldn't forgive her. She stepped closer, her hand almost touching his shoulder. I know it's hard, Jake, but I love you, and I don't want this to end. You love me? Jake almost yelled, his emotions spilling out. I can't understand how that's possible after everything you've done. Emma lowered her head and walked over to the window. She looked out at the street, where it was already beginning to darken. It wasn't just like that, Jake. There was more distance between us. You and we haven't had what we used to have in a long time. I know it doesn't justify me, but I couldn't just sit back and wait for everything to fall apart. Are you trying to say that we're both to blame? His voice changed, turning dull. You cheated on me, and now you think I'm to blame too? Emma turned back to him and took a few steps forward. I don't want you to forgive me right away. I just want you to understand that I'm sorry. I should have said this sooner, but I was afraid that you wouldn't forgive me. Jake felt his heart constrict with pain. He didn't know what to do. All these years together, and now he felt betrayed and abandoned. How could he continue to love her after all this? I can't forget what you've done, he said, walking towards the door. I can't stay here and pretend everything will be the same. He turned and left the room, not looking back. As he walked through the hallway, he heard Emma calling him, but he didn't stop. He walked out through the back door and into the street, trying to make sense of what had happened. Now he had more questions than answers. Who was this second man? How far had her betrayal gone? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? But he wasn't prepared for what awaited him around the corner. Jake had no idea that the answer would be found in a place he never expected. Jake watched as Emma stood before him, her face still full of remorse and her eyes bright with tears. He felt wounded, as though his soul had been torn away and his body was left weak. Her words made his heart seem to stop beating. But this time, it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much more complicated. I can't just forget this, Emma, Jake whispered, clenching his fists. You didn't just cheat on me. You deceived me every step of the way. She clenched her hands into fists, her chest rising heavily from a deep breath. Her face was filled with pain, but also with fear. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Jake, but I want to tell you the truth. I want you to understand that this wasn't just a mistake. What was it then, Emma? He asked, leaning closer. His voice was full of disappointment and anger. You just cheated on me, and now you want me to believe this was more than just a mistake? She looked at him and softly said, It wasn't just Michael. I was seeing someone else. Jake felt his legs give way. It was as though he lost control over his body. His mind was trying to process what had happened, but it was impossible. What do you mean? Jake almost shouted, but held himself back, fearing he wouldn't be able to control his emotions. Emma lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. It wasn't just a physical betrayal. My friend, Tim, was more than just a friend. He was part of my life even before Michael and I became close. I knew I had to choose between you two, but I couldn't. Jake stepped back as if struck by lightning. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. His mind refused to accept it. She hadn't just cheated on him once. It was the third time. And each time, in a completely different context. Don't you think this is too much? His voice was low, barely audible. You didn't just break my trust, Emma. You shattered our life into pieces. I know, Jake. I know it was wrong, and I want you to hear the whole truth. Her voice trembled as she stepped closer to him again. I'm willing to do anything to fix it, but I understand it might be too late. Jake started to realize that the situation was much more complicated than he had imagined. He had always believed in his family, in his wife, but it turned out all his convictions were built on lies. I won't forgive you, Emma, he said, turning his gaze away. But why didn't you tell me earlier? Why now? What do you want from me? She shook her head, unable to find the words to explain everything that had happened. I was weak, Jake. I was afraid you wouldn't understand. Afraid you'd leave me. Silence filled the room, and both of them stood there like two people caught in a trap they had created themselves. And what now? Jake finally asked, turning back to her. Do you want me to trust you again? To turn everything back? Emma didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure what she wanted, but she couldn't look him in the eye and lie, saying everything would be fine. I understand it's impossible, she said softly, but I really want to fix this. Meanwhile, thoughts were swirling in Jake's mind, not allowing him peace. He thought about how he could completely change his life, start fresh. But what if what he felt for her now was just the remnants of what had once been? Could he trust her again? You shouldn't have done this, Emma, he said, deciding that he could no longer stay in this marriage. I can't continue living in a lie. And at that moment, when Jake decided he needed to move on and was already ready to leave, his phone suddenly rang. He looked at the screen. It was Tim, the same Tim with whom his wife had cheated. A call he wasn't expecting. He looked at Emma and, without a word, answered the phone. Jake slowly approached the phone, never taking his eyes off Emma, who stood before him. Her face was full of remorse, but there was still an air of mystery that he couldn't understand. He pressed the answer button, and Tim's voice came through from the other end. Jake, I need to talk to you, Tim said, his voice sounding heavy, as if he was hiding something important behind each word. Jake slightly lowered his head and put the phone down on the table. He had no intention of listening to more lies. He didn't have the strength to endure these games any longer. But Tim, just like his wife, seemed to not leave him in peace. What do you want, Tim? He said, not hiding his anger. He cast a glance at Emma, who stood silently, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. Jake, this is important. I don't want you to find out this way, but it happened. Tim's voice was nervous. You need to know the truth. Emma, probably hearing his tone, quickly lifted her head. There was a hint of panic in her eyes, but she tried to keep herself composed. What happened? Jake asked, although his heart was no longer as calm as before. He felt something much worse was coming. You need to know, this isn't just a betrayal, Tim said, his voice turning more serious. You don't know, but Emma and we were seeing each other before you even found out about us. Jake felt the ground shift beneath his feet as if a wave hit him in the chest. He couldn't believe his ears. This was more than he could have imagined. What do you mean? Jake's voice was barely holding together. He was struggling to understand whether this was really true or just another manipulation. I didn't want to do this, Jake, but I respect you, Tim continued, each word seeming heavy. I was with her before you were. I really was with her, but when you came into the picture, I decided to step back. Now I see how all of this really is. Jake felt his head spinning as if he had been caught in a storm. Tim hadn't just betrayed him. He and Emma had been mocking him all these years. He raised his eyes to his wife, and it was harder than anything. She stood there, just as confused, but there was no remorse in her eyes. Instead, there was a sense that she had long lost everything he had loved in their marriage. How could you, Emma? His voice sounded as though he had lost everything that mattered to him. I trusted you. I thought we were together. And now this? Emma was silent, her eyes filled with tears, but much of her feelings were hidden deep within her heart. Here's the translation into English. She started, but couldn't find the words. I don't need this, Jake interrupted her. You've messed everything up, and I'm not staying in this trap. He grabbed his phone and turned it off, not giving Tim the chance to continue the conversation. He just couldn't handle hearing more. All that mattered now was figuring out what to do next. Do you want an apology, Jake? She asked, her voice filled with despair. Jake looked at her, realizing that words were pointless. He felt nothing anymore except emptiness. No, he said. I don't want to be part of this anymore. Emma couldn't hold back her tears anymore, and they began to roll down her face. But Jake no longer felt any sympathy. He knew it was over. He walked to the door and stopped, looking back at her one last time. I don't know what's next, but I know one thing for sure. It can't be with you, Emma. He said it without anger, only with resolve. Emma stood there, not knowing what to do. All her hopes, all those years spent avoiding this moment, had shattered in one day. Jake left through the door, leaving behind everything he once loved. But as he walked down the dark street, his heart felt heavy. He couldn't just go back to his old life, because now he knew the truth, and the truth hurt far more than any betrayal. Jake stood on the threshold, staring into the darkness of the night, his heart beating faster. He felt each step pull him away from the life he knew, from the family he once loved and believed in. But was it real? What happened to the person he once thought was his one and only? His thoughts were tangled, but one thing was clear. He couldn't be part of this anymore. All he had to do was leave her, walk away, and not look back. After leaving Emma, everything felt completely different. That night, he forgot about the pain, even though he felt a loss like never before. He tried to find peace by taking a walk, but only became more confused with his emotions. His feelings were all over the place. Sadness, anger, pain, and sometimes the thought of revenge. But the biggest question on his mind now was, how could he make sure that all of this didn't go without consequences? He stepped outside and saw a familiar figure. It was Tim. Jake stopped. His heart skipped a beat. Tim? His voice was calm, but inside he felt the tension building. Tim immediately approached him, awkwardly shrugging his shoulders. I didn't know you'd leave. I thought we still had a chance to talk. Jake gritted his teeth. You still have the nerve to approach me after everything that's happened? Tim froze for a moment, anger and shame mixing on his face. I know I was wrong, Jake. I don't even want to justify my actions. I want to apologize. Jake looked at him with a smile that wasn't friendly or triumphant. It was just a smile of disappointment. An apology? After everything? You're telling me that after mocking me and both ruining my life, you just want to apologize? Tim lowered his head. He couldn't respond to those words. But Jake had no intention of letting him justify himself. What now? Jake asked, trying to keep his emotions in check. Do you want to say anything else? Maybe you still want to be part of my problems? Tim was silent for a few seconds, then gave up, lowering his gaze. I understand, Jake, but I can't just leave everything in the past. I can't undo what's happened, but I want to help you deal with this. Jake stared at him, trying to figure out if he was truly remorseful. He looked at Tim again and silently responded. If you want to help, forget about me and your wife. You no longer have the right to be part of my life. Tim, understanding that this was the end, slowly walked away, leaving Jake standing alone at the door. He stood there for a long time, watching him leave. What now? How was he supposed to live? His life had fallen apart in an instant. But this wasn't the end of the story. Jake knew it was only the beginning. While he remained in his head, his heart stayed empty. But then he heard someone's voice. Jake. It was her. Emma. She stood before him with a smile that resembled a mask. He felt her gaze like a heavy burden. She didn't look the same as before. She seemed like a completely different person, perhaps even a stranger. You can't just leave, Jake, she said. Her voice was warm, but it carried fear. She didn't want to lose him. I already left, Jake replied, but he couldn't look away from her eyes. She seemed lost, and her appearance didn't match the way he remembered her. She was alone, her eyes no longer holding the warmth they once shared. I love you, Jake, and I'm sorry. I never wanted this. I don't know how it happened. I just got confused. Her words sounded like an accusation to herself. She didn't know how to fix what she had done. Jake stood before her, his heart still broken, and he didn't know what to do. He couldn't tell her that everything would be okay, because that would be a lie. And he couldn't say that he was ready to go back to something that was no longer there. Do you want me to forgive you? He asked, desperation in his voice. I don't know, Emma replied, her voice trembling, but I'm ready to fight for us. You can't just forget it all. You can't just walk away. Jake looked at her, his eyes empty. He felt it was hard to believe her words, even though he saw suffering in her gaze. But was that enough? Could such a betrayal be forgiven? At that moment, he didn't know the answer. One thing was clear. He could no longer live in deception. Jake stood before Emma, his mind in chaos. Her words hurt more than he could have imagined. She was right in front of him, and he couldn't understand whether she truly regretted it, or if this was just another attempt to manipulate him, as she had always done. He felt he was standing on the edge, and taking a step in either direction meant losing part of himself. How can you talk about love after everything? He asked, his voice trembling with emotion. After you betrayed me more than once? Emma lowered her gaze, and he saw her eyes fill with tears. But this time, her tears didn't seem real to him. I didn't want this, Jake. You know, I was weak. I was trapped in my own feelings. Her words echoed into the emptiness, and Jake felt something inside him break. He didn't want to listen to her apologies anymore. He just wanted one thing. Answers to the questions that were spinning in his head. Do you think I've forgotten everything? That everything can just be fixed with an apology? His voice grew rougher. Do you think you can turn back time? Emma lifted her head and looked at him again. This time, her gaze was stronger, almost accusatory. Jake, you don't understand. I didn't just cheat on you with Tim. There's someone else. Her words hit him like a thunderstrike. He felt the ground slipping from beneath his feet. What? He could barely utter the word again. Her confession was like a cold shower, washing away all his beliefs about her. I met him before everything started with Tim. It was someone I met at the club when you were busy with your work. Her voice trembled, but she couldn't stop. That man, his name was Mike. He was very similar to you, only more confident and charismatic. I was confused, Jake. I couldn't find a way out of this situation. My soul was torn to pieces. Jake, feeling his heart tighten with pain, tried to understand what was happening. Emma's words were hitting him, but he still couldn't believe that she could betray him on such a level. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Emma. His voice was quiet, but somehow even more threatening. You didn't just cheat on me with Tim. You completely turned my world upside down. She took a step toward him, trying to touch his hand, but Jake recoiled, his gaze darkening. Jake, please. I'm ready to do anything to fix this. I'll leave, Mike. I love you. I was foolish. I didn't understand what you truly mean to me. He stood there, looking at her, feeling his soul tear apart. He couldn't find the words to respond. He heard her words, but they didn't penetrate his heart. And how am I supposed to believe you? He finally said. How can I be sure you won't deceive me again? Emma paused, her eyes closed, and she nodded silently, as if admitting her guilt. But then Jake noticed something unusual. The remorse had disappeared from her sad gaze, replaced by something else, coldness. If he weren't so confused, he would have realized this sooner. I can't stay here anymore, Jake. Her words were as unexpected as a stab in the back. She didn't look the same as she had just a few minutes ago. Her face had changed, and he realized she was ready for this moment. You're going to leave? His voice grew deeper. After everything, you decide to leave now? Emma didn't respond immediately. She just slowly began to step back, her gaze growing cold again. Yes, I've made my choice, Jake. She didn't look him in the eye. I choose him. I choose Mike. Jake stood there, stunned, as all his emotions hit him at once. But before Emma left the house, she turned and said her last words. I don't want you to know, but Mike is the one who knows everything about our problems. And now, he's one of us. What do you think about Emma's choice? Should Jake forgive her after all the betrayals and manipulations?